Supervisors Budget Work Session, Wednesday, March 13th. If we could stand for Pledge of Allegiance and a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Moment of silence. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I'll make a motion to adopt the agenda as presented.
Thank you. I've got a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second that motion.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much. All right, we're going on to the county administrator's recommended budget.
Right. Seems like we just did this.
It does.
And just like last year, I'm extremely grateful to have Bonnie on board, who, as you're aware, please, has taken the lion's share of all the work to get us to where we are. She and I attended the school board meeting last night where Dr. Grimsley presented her budget. And had communicated with Dr. Grimsley in the preceding months, weeks and days, and so this budget is aligned, recognizes what the school board saw and ultimately adopted as their recommendation. With that, I will pull up the presentation, shared.
Okay, fair enough. And before I get going on this and forget, this information is loaded to board docs, obviously, the presentation as well as the budget document. It's also on the new budget page of the county's website. So as you're talking with constituents, if you can direct them there, it's going to be a really great place, I think, for them to get information. And at the very end of this, I'd like to spend just a little bit of time walking each of you through what's in this packet as well, because we've tried to anticipate what your questions might be and try to answer those here. Okay, so the fiscal 25 county administrator's recommended budget. As, okay, I'll do it. While he's doing this, I would be remiss if I did not say that I'm very grateful to the department heads and the regional agencies who provided their requests. And this binder right here that you see is full of their requests and the additional information that they provided. And without that, we couldn't have prepared this for the presentation. Okay, we're all set now. As we were developing the recommended budget, these were the budget priorities that we kept in mind and kept bouncing off of each other. And that is maintain the existing levels of service across all functions of government, maintain the county's commitment to regional and partner agencies that help do the work of the county for the citizens, provide a 3% salary adjustment that's at this point aligned with the General Assembly's conference report, adjust the local transfer to meet 98% of the superintendent's reported needs that are in the packet that you received from last night's school board meeting, and do the first 4 bullets, minimizing the impact on the real estate tax rate. This is just a summary slide for the expenditures within each fund for fiscal 25 recommended budget in the middle there compared to the fiscal 24 adopted budget last year, and the dollar and percentage differences of each off to the right there. I I'm gonna spend most of my time in this presentation focused on the general fund, because that's where the bulk of the county side of the budget is. And then we'll get into much more conversation with the superintendent during the budget work sessions on the school budget. But you can see there how those recommended numbers for fiscal '25 break down by fund. Next slide, please. And then the last fund that didn't fit on the previous slide is the capital projects fund. That is funded each year by a transfer of $150,000 of cash from the general fund to the capital projects fund. So while the dollar amount stays the same year to year, the projects change year to year. And there will be a slide specific to those projects later on. So the total expenditures in this budget, net of transfers out to other funds, is $30.2 million, or a $578,000 increase year over year. The transfers out, that is largely driven by the transfer to the schools, is $12 million in fiscal '25, a $539,000 increase, for a total budget, expenditures and transfers, of $42.2 million, an overall 2.7% increase. And it's at this point in the presentation that I'm going to shift the focus entirely to the general fund. And really, this is a walkthrough. The next few slides are going to be a walkthrough of the building blocks of the general fund budget. And I'm going to start on the expenditure side. So if you remember, the first slide showed a goal of maintaining the existing levels of service. On the expense side, when all the adjustments are rolled up, the other than personnel base budget changes are an overall reduction in the general fund. This is the change year to year of $132,000. I will say that is driven by a number of significant decreases in the refuse budget, and that's the result of saying Rappahannock only, and then providing the permits, or Culver providing the permits, and then the revenue to us for the permits that they sell. What offsets that negative to the tune of $20,000 is $20,000 that's a one-time expense in the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office budget for case management software. And that case management software is proposed to be funded with the fund balance in fiscal '25, since that's a one-time expense. We also have a little less than $6,000 that's a placeholder for anticipated increases in property liability and other insurance premiums. We have provided the renewal information to the insurance company, but haven't received the proposed rates yet. So I've assumed a 10% increase year over year there. Just know that may change as we get the renewal rates. Still in the priority maintaining existing levels of service, there were base personnel changes year over year. And keep in mind, as you're looking at this slide, and also as you're looking at the percentage and dollar changes within the details of this budget, that comparison is the recommended budget back to the fiscal '24 adopted budget. And in the middle of that was the 2% increase that happened in December to all employees across all departments. So some of that $69,000 that you're seeing there is that 2% increase. There's also a placeholder for anticipated workers' comp rate increases. I know the last time that I talked with you about workers' comp, I expected that to remain the same. And then 3 days later, we got notice from the insurance company that our modification factor, which is essentially a credit, is going the opposite way than what we would want it to go. And so we are now expecting an increase in the workers' compensation.
It's going from really low to just low.
Yes, it's going from a modification factor of 0.81 to 0.98. And when it increases, the credit to us decreases. Also in this budget, you're going to see, and we'll follow up with this in the second item that's on the agenda related to constitutional officers' pay. The sheriff each requested salary adjustments in the current year that would obviously have an impact on fiscal '25. So we reviewed those requests and expanded that review really to a point of being able to propose a consistent pay methodology for constitutional officers across each office, as well as pulling in the registrar for that assessment. And the impact of that, at least the proposal that is included within the recommended budget, is a $53,000 increase in total, and that's an increase in salaries and related benefits. We'll get into that more as part of the second agenda item. For the first time in a number of years, our VRS rate is actually declining, and there's a $27,000 savings there. Each locality in Virginia has their own specific VRS rate, and so we're thankful that that's going down for us in fiscal '25. And then in terms of the health insurance premium cost, we have received our new rates from the insurance company, and premiums are increasing by 0.2% in fiscal '25. That's another thing to be very thankful for, particularly when last night the superintendent talked about their rate increase being 11%. In terms of notable changes within the general fund expenditures, one of the goals back on that first slide was to provide a 3% salary adjustment aligned with the General Assembly's conference report. We've done that in the figures that you'll see in the budget, and that adds $142,000 for the general fund. And I've noted there, this is only the general fund, since that's our focus in this presentation. Maintaining our commitment to regional and partnering service agencies. There is, and I need to preface this by saying this is not the jail's final request. This is, they're looking at various scenarios. We picked one for this proposal that was in the middle. It's a jail placeholder of an additional $96,000. It assumes a 3% pay increase. It assumes 25 positions are held vacant in that budget. And is there anything you want to add about that, the jail?
Other than I can answer questions, the large increase is mostly due to the fact that we aren't renting as many beds to outside agencies as we have in the last couple of years.
Encompass Community Supports, previously the Community Services Board, made a request of an additional almost $21,000. That's related to increases in their transportation budget, their aging services, and also they are receiving additional state funding that has a required local match. And so that additional match is baked into that $21,000 increase. The Juvenile Center, we really thankfully have not made use of that in the last several years. I think over the last 2 years, as of last week, we had used one bed day. And so we are proposing that we reduce that budget by $12,200. That still leaves a placeholder in our budget that is the equivalent of 100 bed days.
We used to have a contract that there were various tiers where even if we didn't use any, we paid the minimum amount. And 3 or 4 years ago, we've gone to an actual, we pay what we use on a per diem rate.
The net change of contributions to other agencies within the budget, other regional agencies and partners, is about $6,000. Excuse me. And there, you'll see in your budget packet that there's a list of those agencies, what they requested, and what has been included in the budget for them. Still focused on the general fund, we initially, as we were building the budget, adjusted the local transfer to meet the superintendent's reported needs. Her reported needs was a requested increase in the local transfer of $726,000. And I have that big note there highlighted. That was her request, and we'll show you later what's included in this for the proposed transfer. but we're building on what her request was. Changes and transfers to other funds other than the school operating fund, you can see those there. The social services fund, and that's largely driven by, we've assumed a 3% in social services employees pay as well and the associated benefits. Transfer to the library fund, transfer to the debt service fund is a decrease of $8,500. And the transfer to the Children's Services Act fund is a decrease of about $28,000. That is a second year's decrease in that fund based on the actual cases that are happening within that fund. And that amount has been blessed, if you will, that decrease has been blessed, if you will, by the CSA, the Community Policy Management Team. Whereas that was not the case last year when we brought forward a reduction. It had not been blessed by the CPMT. So when all of these expenditure changes that I've gone through in the previous slides are rolled up together, that's an increased general fund expense of $956,000. You're going to see that $956,000 number again on a few slides later. Now we're shifting from the expense side of the general fund to the revenue side of the general fund. And again, these columns are comparing the fiscal 24 adopted budget and then the amount, the proposed projection for fiscal 25's recommended budget. Interest earnings, and each time you see glasses, there's a slide in the appendix where we're going to come back to that because we wanted your eyes to be wide open on these factors. So remember, you'll see interest earnings again. Interest earnings is proposed at $500,000 in fiscal 25. I will say that based on receipts to date and the remaining months of the year, I'm expecting actual revenue for interest earnings in fiscal 24 to be about $650,000, which is amazing. And that's obviously a function of the much higher interest rates than what we've seen in previous years, averaging around 5%, and our much higher fund balance. When we talked about it, we're not anticipating a large drawdown of that fund balance. That's just not on the horizon, not yet. At some point in the future, we do anticipate that for capital projects, namely the courthouse, but we're not anticipating that for fiscal 25. And so another thing that we are anticipating, or at least being cautious about, is the Federal Reserve has said, at least at their most recent meeting, which was back in December, that they anticipate decreasing interest rates by a total of 1 percentage points in 2024. So based on that, and remembering that I'm estimating $650,000 in the current year, I'm budgeting $500,000 in interest earnings for fiscal 25. That is a fluctuating source of revenue. We'll talk more about this in the eyes wide open slide, but just know that that's there for fiscal 25. On the comp board side, all that I've assumed here is how much additional revenue we are likely to receive commensurate with the 3% salary increase for constitutional officers and the comp board supported staff in their offices.
It's probably important to note that while the conference budget includes 3%, the governor's looking at that now. Who knows what he's going to say and then what's going to happen in the reconvened session. And so the revenue will align with an expense, and then what we do is some third factor. We have to pay attention to all that as it moves through the process over the next couple months.
Excuse me. Real estate at the current 55 cents general levy is projected to increase by about $160,000 year over year. Refuse disposal, you'll see, is increasing by about $65,000, and that is 100% driven by the Culpeper permits. And Gary has been, Mr. Curry has been keeping very close track and communication with Culpeper as to what permits they're actually selling. So that's a realistic number there. The Forest Sustainability Fund, at least in the governor's budget, was not in the governor's budget. So that's a $23,000 decrease year over year. However, in the conference budget does assume $2.5 million as the statewide forest sustainability fund allocation, only in fiscal '25. The conference budget has 0 in fiscal '26. So if that comes through, it will likely be a one-time source of revenue that we would want to allocate to one-time things. The forest sustainability fund is limited to use on education, forest sustainability, and outdoor recreation. If the allocation of the $2.5 million becomes a reality, and if it is parsed out the way the $1 million was parsed out in fiscal '23, we are likely to receive about $50,000. Recordations and wills, the activity there is really declining in terms of revenue receipts, and so we've reprojected that for $135,000 in fiscal '25. Public Service Corporation, those assets are not valued locally, they are valued by the State Corporation Commission, and based on the most recent valuation from the State Corporation Commission, those values are decreasing to where fiscal '25's revenue is projected at about a $69,000 decrease. Personal property at the existing $3.48 general levy. Values overall are declining again, and that revenue source is expected to decline by $164,000 year over year. Meals and lodging. This appears to be quite a large decrease, but recall, and I know you will, that the fiscal '24 adopted budget assumed 3/4 of the year would be at a 6% tax rate as opposed to a 4% tax rate. And then in September, when we came back with additional revenue projections, mainly because interest earnings were increased, allowed you all not to have to implement the 6%, and that remained at 4%. So this $565,000 is the same revenue in fiscal '25 that would have been in fiscal '24 had fiscal '24 been 4/4 at 4%. A lot of fours there.
So you're not expecting any increase on the baseline that the 4% is being given?
Correct. We're not seeing any increase now, and I'm not expecting any increase in fiscal '25. So the $122,000 line item here at the top is just a carry forward from the prior page of the prior page's total adjustments. Then we have miscellaneous other changes in revenue throughout the general fund budget, and those miscellaneous things all add up to an increase of $34,000. We have a slight decrease in the transfer from the Fire Services Fund of $2,445. And then one of the very first things that I always do whenever I'm building a budget is I remove the prior year's use of fund balance for one-time things in that prior year's budget. And that's what the $336,000 reduction is. And then as we built this budget and we talked about what one-time expenses remain here in this budget, that's what the $248,000 is. That is shown there. So, at the bottom of this screen, you see overall the year-over-year increase in general fund revenue based on the factors that we just went through is an increase of $66,000. Next slide, please. So the increase in general fund revenue of $66,000, less the increased general fund expenses that we went through previously, an increase of $956,000 means a shortfall to be resolved of $889,000. So we talked about, Mr. Curry and I talked about how to resolve this shortfall again. How do we do that and minimize to the degree possible the impact on the real estate tax rate? And so one of the very first things you see here has the glasses, eyes wide open. One of the first things we did was said, because fiscal '25 is the last debt service payment on the existing debt, what if we used the fund balance to pay that? And then what that does is it frees up the $190,000 that has been the ongoing payment of that debt service to be used for other ongoing things in fiscal '25. Eyes wide open though. What that means is that will not be there in another year when we need to pay for something else or we want to take on new debt, because it's being used to fund the ongoing costs in the fiscal '25 budget. Second thing we talked about was, and this has been, we did this last year, and I think you all may have done this the previous year as well, because in total, the total personal property values are decreasing year over year. We included as part of the proposal a 20 cents increase on the general levy to yield the same revenue that was projected for fiscal '24. So those additional 20 pennies on the personal property general levy gets us $162,000.
So we reduced the rate when the values went through the roof, and then it's increasing as the values are dropping back down. Which we said, don't forget we're doing this, because we're gonna have to deal with it on the other side of the spike.
We talked about if the county is taking the first two steps and what will ultimately be the fourth step there as part of this proposal, then seems that the schools should share in that as well. And so we assumed a reduction in the increased transfer to the schools by the equivalent of 1 penny on the real estate tax rate. So we reduced their transfer request by $191,000. That then left about a $384,000 shortfall, which we are proposing be resolved by a 2 cents increase on the general real estate tax levy from 55 cents to 57 cents. I will note here, and it's the very last line, that these recommended solutions exceed the shortfall amount by about $38,000. That $38,000 is held within the budget, so that as factors continue to change as we're developing this budget, that $38,000 will be there should you need it to balance the budget elsewhere.
Which we know will be changes in revenue, changes in expenses,
Yes.
whatever comes out of the state.
Yes, and before we move on, I just thought of one other thing to let you know about the decreased schools transfer, decreased amount for the additional schools transfer. We learned from the schools last night that the conference report includes about $212,000 in additional state revenue without additional state expenditures for the schools. So if that becomes reality,
More than they assumed in their budget.
yes, more than they assumed in their budget, yes. If that becomes reality, essentially with this and that, if that becomes reality, they'd be balanced. They would be balanced. And their budget also includes an assumption of 3% pay raises, same as ours. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Ms. Smith, that one's gotta be for you.
This is for you.
So happy. So happy.
Not real
Don't
tender,
even
see it right
know.
there.
Yes, yes. Yes, and this
Dear diary.
It finally happened.
finally happened. And to answer your question, not legal tender. Is there in the left-hand side? Okay, so, what's key to being able to do this breakdown is obviously the expense side of the budget, but then for various pieces of the budget, there are associated state and federal revenues that we receive. So you have to do that analysis that says, for instance, of the sheriff's office expense budget, we get X number of dollars from the state, from the comp board, and you have to net that out before doing this exercise. So you're not gonna be able to tie that 55 cents of every dollar. You're not gonna be able to tie that 55% to the schools as a percentage of the total budget, because those aren't the same comparisons. Just want to point that out, because I imagine that will be a question at some point. I don't have any more comments about this, so if you, I'm sure we'll go back to
I
it.
just want to enjoy the slide.
Okay.
Well, it tells a story that we all know,
Mhm.
is that of the core functions of local government, education and public safety are really those core things. And, Health and Human Services falls in there as well, and then you gotta manage it all. So it's not surprising, but it definitely reflects what we all know to be the case. And the other things are really tiny.
Very tiny. Some are so tiny that far right piece is a number of things all accumulated that tie to 4 cents.
Wow.
Like the well,
Yes.
Well, that's now zero, so we're gonna get that right now.
Yeah. Like the contribution to the soil and water conservation district.
Right.
That's rolled up in there. Tourism is rolled up in there. Debt service, believe it or not, is rolled up in there. But that in this year is a function of, there's $190,000 expense for debt service, and then we have use of the fund balance, that's a dedicated revenue source for it. So that's why that's part of the other category this year. Okay, so now after the fun of the dollar graphic, I said earlier we would go back to the capital projects fund so you could see what projects are there for fiscal '25, and that is this slide. The sheriff, I'm gonna skip the first line there for a moment. The sheriff has requested 2 replacement vehicles in fiscal '25. That's not unusual. So $90,000 is the cost there. Emergency Services has requested a turnout gear extractor and dryer. That's just a fancy name for industrial size washer and dryer for the turnout gear that they wear as part of their responses.
And available to the volunteers.
Yes, available to the volunteers as well. That's $13,000. And then, conveniently in terms of dollars, the $47,000 that's there at the top is the balancing figure. But that is also the estimated cost of an additional E911 console unit that the sheriff has requested. We have not included that as a sheriff's item line at this point, pending further discussion and understanding between county admin and the sheriff about exactly what that need is. But we have placed the placeholder there, $47,000. Notable changes in the fire services budget. This is an important one. The association, let me back up. The last 2 years, the association has requested $0 from the county.
Which has been great.
Yes.
Wonderful of them.
Yes, because the funds that they had on hand were sufficient to pay for the expected expenditures in those 2 fiscal years. At this point, obviously, the funds that are available to them have now been diminished because of the use in the last 2 years. And so they have requested a payment from the county of $102,000 to support their services. When we asked for the details behind that $102,000 and really dug into it, and I'm gonna say they were really great about providing that information. $20,000 of the $102,000 is based on a one-time tower repair that occurred in fiscal 2024.
Building tower, not fire truck tower.
Yes, thank you. Building tower at Amosville. If that's a one-time repair, it's not likely to occur again in fiscal '25. And so what we did was remove that from the request amount that gets paid to them on a quarterly basis. And once the board approves the budget in any given year, those quarterly payments happen automatically. We make ourselves a note, we need to make this payment, we make it. So in this instance, if the board were to approve this, an $82,000 payment would be broken up into 4 quarters and paid automatically to the association. What we've done with that $20,000 is put it in the fire services fund contingency. That way, it's there if there's a defined need for it, but it's not an automatic quarterly payment to the association. The board will have an opportunity to come back to that, again, either obviously as part of its budget development, or as part of next year's, ongoing operations, to make a determination if that's something that needs to happen. The treasurer and I were looking at and talking about the Public Service Corporation revenue, at some point, and
You should probably define where that comes from.
okay, Public Service Corporation revenue is real estate revenue that comes from public utilities. So, real estate that's held by, and if there was any personal property, it would be personal property as well. It's just that ours is focused on real estate. Any property that's held by Verizon or Rappahannock Electric or Brightspeed or any of those public utilities. They're assessed by the State Corporation Commission. They are then taxed at our locality's adopted tax rate, both for the general levy and the fire levy tax, and that's how we get that revenue. In the past, both portions, the general levy and the fire levy, the revenue from those has been collected in, accounted for, and resided in the general fund. The fire levy really should be in the fire services fund. And so the treasurer and I talked about that. That is something that our system is capable of. Certainly she and her staff are more than capable of doing that as well. And so she is aware that we were going to be recommending splitting that out and putting the fire levy portion in the fire services fund beginning with fiscal 25.
And that portion's just the 31,000.
Yes, so it's 31,000 that otherwise would be in the general fund coming over to the fire services fund. So when all the fire services fund revenues, both personal property, real estate, now this public service corporation revenue are factored in, and we factor in the fire services fund expenses, which are the company's operational costs, as well as the association's $102,000 request. It causes us.
And the Chester Gap contract.
Yes, and the Chester Gap contract, thank you. It causes us to be short in that fund by $56,000. So we are making use of the available fire services fund balance to balance fiscal 25. And just be aware that $20,000 of that $56,000 is to support the $20,000 that we placed in the contingency that may or may not be a true expense in fiscal 25
For the association.
for the association.
They've contemplated the fixing, or they've done?
They've already fixed it, and it appears they based their 25 request on their 24 expenditures. I think they're using calendar years, but, and those last expenditures included upgrades to the training tower that cost $20,000. So they may have some new use for $20,000 of repairs, but they don't really have many assets, so I'm not sure what it'd be for. But if they express what those needs are to the board, you would have it in your pocket to be able to say, sure, that makes sense.
So why is the glasses there? Because obviously, and each of you knows this, use of one-time money for ongoing expenses is not a best practice, but this was another way we could try to minimize the impact on the real estate tax rate. And so we have assumed use of that $56,000 available fire services fund budget. That will leave an estimated $39,000 in the fire services fund balance at the close of fiscal 25.
So you really get one kick at this can. Couldn't do it again for 56, right? But the alternative is to raise revenue, personal property or real estate for the fire service fund, which didn't seem like a great idea when looking at the rest of this budget.
There's no point in having more balance than you have need.
We don't, and so, right, so is there an expansion of need?
Right.
we don't know in '25, we haven't heard anybody propose anything, we've had a lot of conversations, but we aren't covering our need right now, and we will whittle away our savings fund balance pretty quickly and have no choice and no flexibility for emergency needs, except knowing that the county does have fund balance. And those non-restricted general fund balance dollars could be used for a fire service need if something came up that was unforeseen. But still with eyeglasses.
Yes, eyes wide open. Okay. So again, this is the same slide you saw before, the same budget priorities. We tried to address each one of these in the previous slides and what we did to try to adhere to these priorities. Next slide, please. So this is your budget calendar you're familiar with. The next work session, as we talked about, will be Monday at the courthouse at 9 a.m. And then I did put some information in the appendix. I'm not going to spend time going through this. I just wanted it to be there for your review later. Pie charts. You're welcome, Anita. Pie charts on the expenditures by fund, the revenue by fund, the expenditures by function. Stay on that one just for 1 minute. This is a great example of what I was talking about when we looked at the dollar. You see here that education is 51% of the total budget, but when we looked at tax-supported expenditures, it was 55 cents of that dollar. And that's because the base comparison is not the same. Expenditures by category, 68% of all funds are in personnel, 29% in operating.
A lot of localities would have a much larger slices for capital and debt service.
And then here's the eyes wide open. I tried to hit on each one of these as we were going through, but I also wanted you to have this slide in case you said to yourself, what did she say? Here it is.
Or those who look at this later who didn't have the benefit of hearing
Yes.
the delivery.
Yes. This is that information. And then this will ultimately be a really good segue into your next agenda item when we get to that point. This shows the calculations of what is included in the recommended budget for the constitutional officers in terms of those salary adjustments. So I expect we'll come back to this as part of your next agenda item, but what I'd like to do now before I know you probably have questions and you want some clarification on things. Before we jump into that piece, I'd just like to quickly go through what's in your binder so you know where to go to look for information. Gary's going to pull that up for the benefit of those who are online and for all of our benefits, really.
Bonnie, this is amazing.
Yeah.
I'm glad I put it in there. You know, that was like a last minute thought.
It's the details.
Yes, it's the details. Can you go to the one that has the bookmarks over on the left?
Yep.
Just so they can see how to use this, so the public can see how to use this.
That's a definite possibility.
You got it right there. Thank you. Thank you. This photo was taken by Heidi Meyer, if you know her. She is Ms. Meyer, who served on the school board. She's Ms. Meyer's daughter. And she gave me permission to use this only this one time on the budget document. So I thought that was nice.
Thank you.
Limited license.
A limited license, that's right. Okay, so a lot of this is going to be familiar to you from last year, but there are a few new things. So the budget calendar, if you click on that, Gary. These tabs that are off to the left that he's clicking on are available to anybody who views this online. So if you're talking to your constituents, let them know that that's there too, that's helpful. Here's the budget calendar, same information that was on the slide you saw previously. The table of contents tells you what's here, but it also, you click on any one of those and it gets you right to that item. So I think that's helpful. The financial summary section, which is generally the first section in any budget document, this is a high level, very high level look at each fund. So, there you go, Larry. Yes.
Showing them that it expands.
Yes, it expands. That's all funds, so that's every fund rolled up, and it's rolled up by category, revenue category. Then it's rolled up by expenditure category, and then down at the bottom, you see the breakdown of personnel, operating, debt service, and capital. When you look at the individual fund pages that are like this, you'll see it for each individual fund. Yeah, go ahead to the general fund. So these pages all look exactly the same. It's just at the top there, it tells you what fund this is. This is the recommended budget for the general fund.
So if we look in the capital fund, it's only stuff in capital.
Yep, there's
That makes
only
sense.
stuff in capital. And there's only stuff in the capital projects expenditure line item as well, so that makes sense. Then there is revenues by fund. And this is the line item detail of revenues. So you saw this last year. There are notes off there to decide when we thought either the dollar adjustment or the percent adjustment might need some explanation. So this just goes revenues, fund after fund after fund, which you can get to again there, the bookmarks on the left.
So, just to put a point on, as she identified in the presentation, the natural growth for real estate revenue is shown in this top line, and that's at 55 cents. And then the additional from the extra 2 cents is shown on the next line. So you can see both breakouts. Same thing for personal property.
So you have this revenue breakdown for each revenue within each fund. And that takes you all the way to page 39 within your document, within your hard copy document. And on page 39 begins the expenditure detail by fund. Same thing as revenues, except this is just the expense side of the budget. That information takes you all the way to page 63, which is, I'm sorry, this is all the way to the bottom of that. Up one, I'm sorry, up one to,
Ooh.
this right here, debt amortization. Okay, this debt amortization, in most localities, this would be a much longer list with many, many years. But because fiscal 25 is the last year of our debt service, you see fiscal 26 is 0 all the way across, and that's pretty incredible. It really is. Okay, then this is the section that, a lot of this is gonna be new in the additional information section. We did have in last year's recommended budget a general fund comparison year over year. So what this does, and Ms. Smith, I was thinking about a question that you asked last year pertaining to when are we gonna look at the detail of each account, or at least in you know, rolled up categories, when are we gonna look at that? I tried to answer some of that question here on this page by saying, what are the big pieces that are changing year over year in the general fund? And this starts on each side, revenues and expenses, with the fiscal 24 revenues and expenses, they're at the top. And then shows the changes on each side, revenues on the left, expenses on the right, and gets you down to the general fund total for fiscal 25 on both sides. The next page.
Big number, transfer to school operating fund, right?
Yes, transfer to school operating fund, that is the increased transfer to the school operating fund, in the proposed budget at least. And again, it's a penny less than what they requested. Next page, Gary, thank you. This is the budgeted use of the general fund balance in fiscal 25. I wanted you to know what we had assumed is being funded with fund balance. So the very top one there is that $190,000 of debt service. The next $100,000 is consistent year to year. We tend to use $100,000 of the fund balance for the contingency. The next $50,000 is a carryover from last year's budget to this year's budget. $50,000 for professional services and ordinance revisions by the Planning Commission. If they use it, it comes from the fund balance. If they don't, it remains in the fund balance. Then you can see there what the other line items are, and then I mentioned that the very bottom line item, I mentioned that all of the solutions that we found to solve the shortfall ended to the good, if you will, by about $38,000. That's this negative use of the fund balance. That's where I've parked that money for the time being.
Because the revenues must equal the expenses at the end of the day for the
Yes.
budget. So it's balanced.
Yes. Next page, I mentioned this as we were going through. This is the regional service agencies and partners page. You can see there all the agencies, what they requested, and then what is included in the recommended budget for each agency. One thing that we did differently this year, and this was something that we learned, again, Ms. Smith, thanks to a question that you had last year. You asked, and they provided, the businesses of Rappahannock provided a letter saying how they use the $10,000 that Rappahannock provides to them each year. And the answer was a number of things, but the answer was, we use it to maintain the Explore Rappahannock website, tourism-based website. We use it to support Sperry Fest. We use it to support the farm tour. And so this year, what we did here on this summary, as well as within the expense detail of the tourism budget, we just broke that down, because I think some don't know that that money ultimately comes from the county. The county is already funding Sperry Fest. The county is already funding a portion of the farm tour. And so we've broken that out, so that that can be explicit in there.
That's great. I really appreciate you doing that.
The next page is basically the math of the dollar. This is how I derived the percentages for the dollar. It starts with the each department within the general fund and the general levy, the recommended budget for that department, the associated revenues, which ultimately net out to be the net tax-supported expenses.
So essentially restricted outside revenue, is that what that is, or restricted? Revenue that's restricted only for that use.
The associated revenues, yes, are restricted only for that use, yes. And then the net of those two columns is the second column from the right, the net tax support, and then the percentages are derived from that. So the 55% at the top equals the 55 cents that you see on the dollar, which is the next page.
And so that was, this, I guess that basis as opposed to that.
Correct, correct,
51 versus 55.
yes. And there's the dollar. And then last year, there was a request, and I've continued to provide this information this year and will into the future as well. There was a request of the detail of the rolled up salary accounts. That's what's here. We maintain the rolled up salary accounts within the budget detail, but then this is an explanation of how that breaks down further. And then the final thing, and I know you're all saying, thank goodness. The final thing is a listing of the full-time equivalent staffing positions. We've not broken down the part-time into full-time equivalencies before, and I just thought that was something important to do, and it's pretty standard. And so the part-time, full-time equivalencies here are based on the budgeted number of hours for those positions, divided by 2,080 hours, which is a full 40-hour week, 52 weeks a year setup.
So just a good example in refuse right now, over the last couple of years, we've shifted from 3 full-time employees and 0.31 part-time full-time equivalents to 2 full-time employees and then 1.5 part-time equivalent. Provides us more flexibility to kind of move people in and out and reduces our mandatory benefits costs. and opens us up to a different group of people who might be willing to work. Some people need full-time, other people need part-time. And so you can track the changes over time. That's the last page.
That's it.
Wow.
That's it for now.
Nice job.
Thank you.
That was a lot of work. And 2 years of that has just been so nice to see. Great, easy to read, easy to follow. You can look at last year, this year. Thank you so very much. Questions for Bonnie? Asks for
I'm just so glad you all have it set up to pay off that last debt service payment on the fund balance. I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. I'm really looking forward to getting that paid off. You know, I always want to avoid a tax increase. So I do think if there is an opportunity to be more bullish on interest rates, revenue, and maybe split the difference on the forest sustainability dollars. If it could be as much as 50 and as little as 0, maybe just figure it for 25 and split the difference there.
The concern for the forest sustainability is the conference budget includes it in the first year, but not the second year.
I know.
So
It's
building in
always-
those holes is.
It's always a thrill ride every year here.
We'd much rather use that for one-time use.
I understand
And the
what you're
interest,
saying.
it's an appetite for risk, as we've talked about
Well, yeah,
before.
and 100%, and, you know, if we had a dwindling or meager fund balance, I would certainly agree. But we have a robust fund balance, and even though we thought in recent years, we were being very conservative with our projections, the fund balance continues to grow and grow. And so, I have a hard time seeing why we would have a tax increase when the fund balance has been outpacing itself year after year. Which is a great thing, I'm not complaining.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about in the context of how much interest we make on it, vis-a-vis a penny. And if you reduce it, I mean, it's only, you know, it'd be really interesting to see how that.
You don't have to go back too many years, when that 650,000 was under 100 or about 100,000.
Yeah.
Because the rates were practically zero.
Well, we did 3,500 like 4 years ago, right?
It was low, so I
Yeah,
mean,
super low.
it can come, it can go, it will go predictably when we reduce our cash position and invest that cash fund balance into capital projects. It will also not accumulate as quickly when the rates drop, if and when the rates drop. That's the unknown. The known is you will invest those dollars. That's why you have accumulated them. You know you have huge one-time projects coming up. The extent that you can use those dollars for that will reduce what you have to borrow, which will reduce your debt service, which is great at the end of the day.
I do have a question about the school's insurance. And why is ours 0.2 and theirs is 11 million?
The schools, our insurance, we're so small, we're rated on a pool of small entities. We're a function of the pool, and it's not our particular experience, how much insurance we used, how many people had babies or baby surgeries or whatever. The schools are large enough, they're rated on their own experience. And so, people need insurance, why it's there. And so their experience has suggested that increase. Fortunately, there was zero for 3 or 4 years in a row, and the last 2 years has not been zero. I think we looked real quick last night, and I believe their rates are still lower than ours. So percentages can be deceiving.
So did the hundreds of thousands of dollars coming from Richmond show up in the school budget?
Well, no money comes from Richmond until the governor and the general assembly get on the same page.
Yes, I just want to make sure we're counting all those
Through
dollars.
brute force or congeniality?
The forest sustainability contemplation was in, you said the governor? Where is it?
Conference.
It's in the conference.
So the Senate had 5 million, the House had 0.
And the governor
It came
had
to
zero.
the governor had 0. The conference committee in the dark room said 2.5. At the same time, they said, get rid of Rappahannock's supplemental cap reduction. We'd rather have that. So now it's in the light of day, we'll see what happens.
The other thing I think might be helpful, talking about the 4% versus 6% projections for meals and lodging, is if we could have a year-to-date review of that. Because I know we were pretty optimistic about that last year and had concerns about recent changes in local establishments and whether that number would fluctuate very much. And so it would be good to know what we really realized from those changes. And the other thing that would be helpful to know, I drilled into a little bit the section of state code that pertains to the additional 2% that we've imposed on housing that has to be earmarked for tourism. It would be interesting to get a grasp on those numbers too, because we have had people inquiring about that.
Okay.
And I do think we have long-term projects that we could gear those dollars toward, and it would be nice to have a plan.
And the budget is fully consuming those restricted dollars for the tourism budget, which visitor center and
Right.
things like that.
Yep.
And some of these others, and then tourism-related expenses in other areas such as
Security.
public safety.
Yeah.
Remember that Rappahannock County and Madison County uniquely have the authority to levy a combined tax, meals and lodging. And that section does not restrict the 2%. So for the establishments that are charged the combined, because they do meals and lodging, that doesn't go to the restriction.
Got it.
The restaurants that are just meals don't go to the restriction, so it's
Exactly.
the lodging only
Paired with meals.
is, but the lodging only by itself, that
That's
is
what's the 2%.
the,
Okay.
that's right. It gets very confusing.
Well, I guess that's why I'm requesting, because we have heard some people asking for more information on that, and it is an understandable going concern that it would be nice to drill into those numbers and let folks know we do hear what they're saying, and we are doing that already.
And one of the things that we reviewed last year is that the restricted revenues need to be invested or distributed after review by a local tourism lodging-based committee
Right.
or a public hearing.
Right.
And so your budget public hearing satisfies the public hearing part,
Good.
if you fully distribute those funds.
Sounds good. I appreciate that.
So the school board last night, after hearing the presentation, just adopted the budget. So if you want to do that, you can do that right now. Actually, you can't, you have to have a public hearing.
That's right.
They know that there is an on-ramp to an eventual budget, a necessary step, as is this. And there's a lot of work left to do. And we didn't really talk in detail about the schedule. But as you know, the process now is to shape this into what you will put out to the public for the official public hearing, and what rates you will put out to the public for the official tax rate public hearing. And so the focus has to be, what is the package that you want to share with the public to get their feedback? And that package will affect which sectors of the public comes speak to you. And so it's tricky, difficult work to figure out what is the best package to put out. Once you do that, then you have to assimilate that input, hopefully see what the state did, and come together with a final budget sometime end of April, beginning of May, before May 15th for the schools.
I know you did a lot of research last year and this year, just budget in general. I'm not a fan of taxes, but I kind of like use taxes. Is there any, have you looked at other counties, is there anything creative out there that small rural counties have done to try to just make a little extra money somehow to not have to raise as much? You know, I know the gas tax is, the state is in on that and stuff like that, but is there anything out there that we haven't looked at that may not be hard to swallow?
I I can certainly go through the authorizations in the state code, and I think that would be a good exercise anyway, and say, we have this, and these are the rates that we have, compared to what the rates are that are allowed, the maximum rates allowed by the state. And then what taxes are authorized that we just don't do. And I think we can present that in, a page or two, and then you have the information now and going forward.
It'd just be interesting to see.
I know one that comes up at the planning commission pretty frequently is, it's not really a tax, but it's a registration fee for, tourist homes or Airbnb short-term rentals. And, it's a good way to keep a registry of those establishments and also show that they're still in use. And I think, Mr. Henry usually brings up, Shenandoah County does an annual, registration fee equivalent to one night's rental of the Airbnb, so that way they know who's still got active listings, and it does generate some revenue for the county.
And so that ordinance that the board adopted this past year,
Mhm.
that's where it would land, and it would go through that ordinance process.
Not a lot of juice, but it might be worth the squeeze and give us information, which I think is helpful.
We do have the registry, we just don't have the fee.
Wow. But are they active? I mean, that's always my question, is they might be on the list, but are they?
Right.
Is it worth paying one night's registration fee annually to keep their status?
Great questions.
Anything else?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
I always love the graphics, and the dollar bill was a huge hit.
Yes.
So happy. And then the glasses, all I can say is, so Sally Jesse Raphael. I just saw them, and I was just like, wow. I'm really dating myself.
I told Gary the graphics started out being an eye, and that just was creepy.
Well, if the glasses start blinking or something. Wow.
Next year, I'll work on that for next year.
I love it. Don't change a thing.
Yep.
But thank you, Bonnie, for pulling that together.
You're welcome.
Really digestible. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm over these numbers.
Moving into the constant